I have carried the memory of him with me for nearly 30 years now, and though the world has moved on and I have grown old, the ache has never truly faded. If you have ever loved someone you were never meant to touch, someone whose world was so far above your own that even speaking his name felt like a transgression, then perhaps you will understand why I must tell this story now, before time takes it from me entirely. Please, stay with me. If you have ever believed in love that defies every rule, you will want to hear what happened in that grand house all those years ago. I arrived at Thornfield Manor in the autumn of 1891, when I was 22 years old and desperate enough to take any position that would keep me from the workhouse. The estate rose from the Derbyshire hills like something out of a dream, all gray stone and tall windows that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back in shades of amber and gold. I had never seen anything so beautiful, and I had never felt so small. The housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, met me at the servants' entrance with a face like carved marble and a voice that could freeze water. She looked me over with the kind of scrutiny one might give a horse at market, taking in my worn dress and the thin shawl I had wrapped around my shoulders against the October chill. She told me that I would be responsible for the morning rooms, the library, and the upper hallway, that I would rise at 5 and work until my tasks were finished, and that I was never, under any circumstances, to speak to the family unless directly addressed. I nodded and kept my eyes lowered, as I had learned to do in the 3 previous houses where I had worked, and I followed her through a maze of corridors that smelled of beeswax and old wood and something else I could not name. Privilege, perhaps, or simply the particular scent of a world I would never belong to. The Count himself I saw only twice in my first month, and both times from a distance. He was a tall man with silver hair and a bearing that suggested he had never questioned his place in the world, not even once. His wife had died some years before, Mrs. Daventry told me, in one of her rare moments of something approaching conversation, and he lived now with his son and daughter, both grown, both unmarried, both subjects of much speculation among the staff. The daughter, Lady Catherine, was beautiful in the cold, remote way of fine porcelain, and she swept through the halls with her chin lifted as though the very air we breathed was beneath her notice. But it was the son who stopped my heart the first time I saw him. I was polishing the banister in the main staircase, working the cloth in small circles the way Mrs. Daventry had shown me, when I heard footsteps on the landing above. I glanced up without thinking, and there he was, tall and dark-haired, perhaps 28 or 30, dressed in a morning coat of deep blue that made his eyes look almost black in the dim light filtering through the stained glass window behind him. He paused at the top of the stairs, one hand resting on the newel post, and for just a moment our eyes met. I felt something shift inside my chest, some understanding I could not name, and then I dropped my gaze and pressed myself against the wall as he descended past me without a word. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor below, and I stood there with my heart hammering and my hands shaking so badly I had to set down my cloth and press my palms against my apron until the trembling stopped. I told myself I was being foolish, that men like him looked through girls like me as though we were made of glass, that I had felt nothing more than the natural terror of a servant caught idling by her betters. But I knew even then that I was lying to myself. His name was Edward, though of course I could not call him that, could not call him anything at all. To the servants he was Master Edward, or the young master, and we spoke of him in whispers when Mrs. Daventry was out of earshot, trading small observations like treasures. Mary, who worked in the kitchens, said he had been away at university for years and had only recently returned, that the Count was pressuring him to marry, that there was talk of an engagement to the daughter of a neighboring estate. Sarah, who attended to Lady Catherine, said he spent most of his time in the library or riding alone across the moors, that he seemed troubled, that he had the look of a man carrying some great weight he could not set down. I listened to these fragments and hoarded them like a miser hoards coins, and I hated myself for caring. For weeks I saw him only in passing, a glimpse of him crossing the entrance hall, the sound of his voice through a closed door, the faint scent of tobacco and bay rum that lingered in the library after he had been there. I learned his habits without meaning to, the way one learns the patterns of weather or the turning of seasons. He rose early and took his breakfast alone. He walked the grounds most afternoons, regardless of the weather. He read late into the night, and sometimes when I came to lay the fires before dawn, I would find the lamps still burning in the library and books scattered across the desk as though he had fallen asleep over them and then woken and gone to bed without tidying them away. I would gather the books carefully, noting the titles even though I barely understood most of them. And I would imagine what it must be like to have so much time, so much freedom, so much world at your fingertips that you could spend your nights lost in philosophy and poetry while the rest of us scrubbed floors and hauled coal. It was in the library that he first spoke to me. I had just finished dusting the shelves and was reaching up to adjust a volume that had been pushed back too far when I heard his voice behind me, low and startling in the silence. He said, "You needn't be so careful with them. They're meant to be used, not enshrined." I spun around so quickly I nearly dropped my cloth, and there he was, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and something that might have been amusement in his dark eyes. I stammered an apology and felt my face go hot, but he waved a hand as though dismissing it and crossed to the desk, where he began sorting through a stack of correspondence with the kind of distracted efficiency that suggested his mind was elsewhere. I stood frozen, uncertain whether I had been dismissed or was expected to continue working, and finally I turned back to the shelves and resumed my dusting with hands that felt clumsy and thick. Behind me I could hear the soft scratch of his pen, the rustle of paper, and I was so aware of his presence that I could barely breathe. When I finished and turned to leave, he looked up and said, "What's your name?" His voice was gentle, curious, and I hesitated before answering because no one in the family had ever asked me that before. I told him, my voice barely above a whisper, and he nodded as though filing the information away somewhere. He said, "Thank you for keeping the library so well. It's my favorite room in the house." Then he returned to his work, and I fled before I could do something foolish like cry. After that, he began to notice me, or perhaps I only began to notice that he noticed me. When I passed him in the hallway, he would nod, a small acknowledgement that sent my heart racing. Once, when I was carrying a heavy scuttle of coal up the back stairs, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find him there, and before I could protest, he had taken the scuttle from my hands and carried it the rest of the way up, setting it down outside the door to the drawing room and then stepping back with a slight smile that made my throat tighten. He said, "You shouldn't be carrying things like that alone," and I said, "It's my work, sir." And he looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Even so." Then he was gone, and I stood there in the dim hallway with soot on my apron and tears prickling behind my eyes, because no one, in all my years of service, had ever suggested that my comfort mattered even a little. Winter came and wrapped the estate in silence, snow muffling the world beyond the windows and turning the gardens into something from a fairy tale. The work grew harder. More fires to lay, more mud tracked in from the stables, more demands from the family as they prepared for the Christmas season and the endless parade of visitors that came with it. I saw less of Edward during those weeks. Or rather, I saw him only in the context of the larger household, surrounded by guests and obligations, and the distance between us felt insurmountable. But then, 2 nights before Christmas, everything changed. I had stayed late to help with the preparations for the next day's dinner, and by the time I finished, it was past midnight and the house had fallen into that particular stillness that comes only in the deepest hours of night. I was making my way toward the servants' quarters, my candle casting long shadows on the walls, when I heard a sound from the music room, a single note on the piano, then another, soft and hesitant as though someone were testing the keys. I should have kept walking. I should have known better than to investigate, but something drew me to the door, some curiosity or loneliness or recklessness I could not name. I pushed it open just enough to see inside, and there was Edward, sitting at the piano in his shirt sleeves, with his collar loosened and his hair falling across his forehead. He was playing a melody I did not recognize, something slow and melancholy, and he looked so alone in that vast room that my heart ached for him. He must have sensed my presence because he stopped abruptly and turned, and for a moment we simply stared at each other across the darkness. Then he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake anyone." And I said, "You didn't, sir, I was just finishing my work." And neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we could not say, and then he said, "Do you like music?" I told him I had never learned, that such things were not for people like me, and something flickered across his face, pain, or anger, or perhaps just sadness. He said, "That seems a great injustice," and before I could stop him, he had crossed the room and was standing in front of me, so close I could smell the faint scent of brandy on his breath. He said, "What's your favorite sound in the world?" And I thought of rain on the roof of my childhood cottage, of my mother's voice singing while she worked, of wind in the trees on summer evenings. And I said, "Rain, I think, when you're safe and warm inside." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger and less burdened, and he said, "Mine too." We stood there in the doorway, neither of us moving, and I knew I should leave, knew that every second I stayed was dangerous. But I could not make myself go. Finally he stepped back and said, "You should get some rest." And I nodded and fled, my candle flame guttering in my haste, and I did not sleep at all that night for thinking of the way he had looked at me, as though I were something precious, something worth seeing. After that night, we began to seek each other out in small, careful ways. He would leave books in the library with pages marked, and I would read them in stolen moments and return them with the markers moved to passages I had found beautiful or true. Sometimes I would find notes tucked between the pages, nothing improper, just a line of poetry or a question about what I thought of the author's argument, and I would respond in pencil in the margins, my handwriting cramped and uncertain next to his elegant script. We never spoke of this correspondence, never acknowledged it in the light of day, but it became a lifeline for me, proof that I was more than just a pair of hands to scrub and carry and serve. In February, a great storm came and trapped us all inside for 3 days, the snow piling so high against the doors that the men had to dig us out. The house grew cold despite the fires, and everyone was restless and short-tempered. On the second night, I was bringing more coal to the drawing room when I heard raised voices, the Count's booming bass and Edward's quieter tones, though I could hear the steel beneath his words. I should not have listened, but I pressed myself against the wall outside the door and held my breath. The Count was demanding that Edward settle on a date for his engagement to Lady Arabella, the daughter of some earl or duke whose name I could not quite catch. Edward said he would not be rushed, that he had concerns, that he wished to be certain, and the Count said something sharp about duty and family and reputation, and then Edward's voice cut through the air like a blade. He said, "I will not marry without love, father, no matter how advantageous the match." And the Count laughed, a harsh sound without humor, and said, Love is a luxury for poets and shopkeepers, Edward, not for men of our position." There was a long silence, and then Edward said something too low for me to hear, and a door slammed somewhere deeper in the house. I hurried away before I could be discovered, but my mind was racing. So it was true then. They were planning his marriage, arranging his life like pieces on a chessboard, and he was resisting. The knowledge should have made me happy, should have given me hope, but instead, it only made everything worse because I understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly how impossible the gulf between us really was. He might refuse this Arabella, but he would eventually accept someone, some woman of his own class who could give him children and stand beside him in society, and I would remain what I had always been, invisible, disposable, nothing. That night I could not sleep, and sometime around 3 a.m. I gave up and wrapped myself in my shawl and crept down to the kitchens, thinking I might make myself tea. But when I opened the door, I found Edward already there, sitting at the great wooden table with a single candle burning beside him and a bottle of brandy open in front of him. He looked up when I entered, and I saw that his eyes were red-rimmed and weary. He said, "I seem to have made a habit of finding you in the small hours." And I said, "Or perhaps I have made a habit of finding you, sir." And he laughed, a short, bitter sound, and said, "Don't call me that. Not here, not now. My name is Edward." The use of his Christian name felt like a transgression, like stepping off a cliff into open air, but I made myself say it. Edward. He closed his eyes as though the sound of it pained him, and then he said, "Sit with me, please. I cannot bear to be alone tonight." I should have refused. Every rule I had been taught, every instinct of self-preservation, told me to run. But instead, I crossed the stone floor and sat across from him at the table, and when he pushed the bottle toward me, I took a sip that burned my throat and made my eyes water. We sat in silence for a long time, the candle burning down between us, and finally he said, "Do you ever feel as though your entire life has been mapped out for you? As though every choice you might make has already been decided by people who died 100 years ago?" I thought of my own life, of how I had never had any choices at all, and I said, "Yes, but in a different way, I think." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and he said, "Tell me about yourself. Tell me something true." So I told him about my childhood in a cottage on the edge of a village whose name he would not have known, about my father who died when I was 12, and my mother who followed him 2 years later, about the vicar's wife who arranged for me to go into service because there was nowhere else for me to go. I told him about the houses I had worked in before Thornfield, the cruelty I had endured, the way I had learned to make myself small and quiet and invisible because that was the only way to survive. I told him things I had never told anyone, and he listened with an intensity that made me feel as though my words mattered, as though I mattered. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm and strong around mine, and he said, "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, this aristocrat with his books and his grand tour of Europe and his centuries of breeding, telling a housemaid she was extraordinary. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw that he meant it, that he saw me in a way no one else ever had, and something broke open inside me. I said, "You cannot say such things to me." And he said, "Why not, if they're true?" And I said, "Because I am nothing, because this is impossible, because even speaking to you like this could cost me everything." And he tightened his grip on my hand and said, "Then we will be careful, but I will not pretend I do not see you. I will not pretend you are invisible when you are the only person in this house who is truly alive. We sat there with our hands joined across the table, and I felt as though I were standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying and inevitable. Finally, I pulled away and stood, and I said, "I must go." And he did not try to stop me, but as I reached the door, he said my name, and when I turned back, he said, "I am not sorry for this, whatever happens. I want you to know that." I nodded because I could not speak, and then I fled back to my little room under the eaves and lay in the darkness, wondering what we had begun and how it would end. After that night, we grew bolder, or perhaps we simply grew desperate. We found ways to be near each other, stolen moments in the empty hallway between the library and the drawing room, conversations hidden in the shadows of the servants' stairs, meetings in the conservatory late at night when the rest of the house slept. He would touch my face, brush a strand of hair behind my ear, trace the line of my jaw with his fingertips as though memorizing it. I would let myself lean into him, feel the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. We spoke in whispers about everything and nothing, his dreams of travel, of doing something meaningful with his life rather than simply managing the estate and producing an heir, my dreams of learning to read properly, of perhaps one day having a little shop where I could sell flowers or baked goods and be my own mistress. They were impossible dreams, both of them, but in those dark hours they felt real, and we could pretend that the world beyond our bubble did not exist. The first time he kissed me, we were in the conservatory, hidden among the orange trees and the scent of jasmine. It was late March, and the moon was full, casting silver light through the glass walls, and I had come down because he had left a note tucked into a book asking me to meet him. When I arrived, he was standing by the fountain, and he turned as I entered and simply held out his hand. I went to him without hesitation, and he pulled me close and said, "I have been wanting to do this since the first moment I saw you on the stairs." And then his mouth was on mine, and the world fell away. His kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though he feared I might break. But when I pressed closer and slid my arms around his neck, he deepened it, his hands tangling in my hair, and I felt something ignite between us, a hunger that frightened and exhilarated me in equal measure. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and he rested his forehead against mine and said, "God help me, I love you. I love you, and I do not know what to do about it." I should have told him to stop, should have reminded him of all the reasons this was madness. But instead I said, "I love you too." And the words felt like a confession and a condemnation all at once. We stood there clinging to each other, and outside the wind rattled the glass walls, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed 2, and I knew that we had crossed a line from which there was no returning. For weeks we existed in a strange, suspended state, caught between terror and joy. We were careful, so careful, but I think now that we were also reckless in our certainty that love alone could protect us. We met when we could, always in darkness, always in secret, and each time we went a little further. His hands at my waist, my fingers in his hair, kisses that left us both shaking and desperate for more. He would hold me against the wall in the narrow corridor behind the library, his body pinning mine, and I would feel the evidence of his desire and know that he was holding himself back with every ounce of his considerable will. I did not make it easier for him. I was as hungry as he was, as desperate to feel something real in a world that so often felt like nothing but performance and pretense. But we both knew the stakes, knew that what we were doing was dangerous in ways that went far beyond simple scandal. It was inevitable, I suppose, that someone would notice. Sarah caught me once slipping out of the library at dawn, my hair mussed and my apron crooked, and though I invented some excuse about having fallen asleep while cleaning, I saw the speculation in her eyes. Mrs. Daventry began watching me with a new suspicion, and I felt her gaze on me constantly, waiting for me to make a mistake. The Count announced that Lady Arabella and her family would be visiting in May, and the house went into a frenzy of preparation, and Edward grew more withdrawn and desperate as the date approached. We met less often during those weeks, the risk too great. But when we did manage to steal a moment, he would hold me so tightly I could barely breathe, and he would whisper that he was trying to find a way, that he would not let them force him into a marriage he did not want, that somehow we would find a solution. But there was no solution, and I think we both knew it. Men like Edward did not marry housemaids, no matter how much they might love them. The world was not built for such things, and we were fools to have let ourselves believe otherwise. When Lady Arabella arrived with her family in mid-May, I saw her from a distance, tall and elegant with blonde hair and the kind of effortless grace that comes from a lifetime of knowing you belong in rooms like these. She smiled at Edward with confidence and familiarity, and he smiled back with the polished courtesy of his upbringing, and I felt something die inside me as I watched them together. That night, he found me in the linen closet where I had gone to cry in private, and he pulled me into his arms and said, "This changes nothing." But we both knew he was lying. He kissed me with something like desperation, and I kissed him back. And when his hands began to wander, I did not stop him, because I knew, somewhere deep in my bones, that this was the beginning of the end. We did not consummate our love. He would not take that from me when he could offer me nothing in return, when the risk to my already precarious position was so great. But we went as far as honor would allow, and afterward we lay together on the floor, with nothing but a folded tablecloth beneath us, and he stroked my hair and told me all the things he wished he could give me, all the ways he would love me if the world were different. I let him talk and tried to memorize every word, the timbre of his voice, the weight of his body beside mine, because I knew I would need these memories to sustain me through all the years ahead. The crisis came on a Thursday evening in early June. I was in the upper hallway preparing to turn down the beds when I heard voices below. The Count, and with him a man I did not know, some guest or perhaps a business associate. They were discussing Edward, and I froze at the top of the stairs, hidden in shadow, but able to hear every word. The stranger was asking about the engagement, and the Count was assuring him that it would be announced formally within the fortnight, that Edward had finally accepted his duty, that the wedding would likely take place in August. Something inside me cracked, split clean through, and I must have made some sound, because suddenly the Count looked up and saw me standing there. His face darkened, and he barked at me to get about my business, and I fled to the servants' quarters and did not come out until morning. The next day, Mrs. Daventry summoned me to her sitting room, and I knew before she spoke what was coming. She told me that there had been talk, that my behavior had been noticed, that while she had no proof of actual impropriety, my presence in the household had become untenable. She said that the Count had authorized her to provide me with a month's wages and a reference, and that I was to leave within the week. I did not protest because there was no point. She was being more generous than she had to be, and we both knew it. I simply nodded and returned to my room and began to gather my few possessions. I did not see Edward for 2 days, and I thought perhaps he did not know I was leaving, that perhaps no one had thought to tell him. But on my last evening at Thornfield, he found me in the library where I had gone to return the book we had been sharing, the one with all our notes and underlinings and secret conversations written in the margins. He stood in the doorway and looked at me, and his face was ravaged, hollow with grief and rage and helplessness. He said, "They're sending you away," and I said yes, and he crossed the room and grabbed my shoulders and said, "I won't let them. I'll find a way." But I put my hand over his mouth and shook my head. I said, "There is no way. You know that. This was always going to end." He pulled me into his arms and held me, and I felt him shaking, felt the wetness of his tears against my hair. He said, "Come with me, tonight. We'll go to London or to the continent. I have some money of my own. We could—" But I stopped him again, because I knew what he was offering and what it would cost him. I said, "You would lose everything. Your family, your inheritance, your place in the world, and I would become your mistress, your shame, the woman who ruined you. In 5 years, you would hate me, and I could not bear that." He said, "I could never hate you." And I said, "Perhaps not, but you would hate yourself, and that would be worse." We stood there in the library with the late sun slanting through the windows and the books looking down on us like silent witnesses. And I memorized the feel of him, the warmth and solidity and rightness of his body against mine. Finally, I pulled back and looked up at him, and I said, "I want you to know that loving you was the most real thing I have ever felt. Whatever happens, whatever you do with your life, you gave me that gift. You made me feel seen." He cupped my face in his hands and kissed me, long and slow and deep, and it was nothing like our earlier kisses. This was goodbye. This was grief. This was the taste of something beautiful dying. When he pulled away, he pressed something into my hand, a small leather-bound volume, the book of poetry we had shared, with all our notes and markings still inside. He said, "Keep this. Remember me." I said, "I could never forget you." And then I walked away before I could change my mind, before I could beg him to damn the consequences and take me anyway. I left Thornfield the next morning before dawn, walking down the long drive with my bundle on my back and my eyes dry because I had no tears left. I did not look back at the house because I knew if I did, I would not be able to keep walking. I found work in a village 30 miles away, and then another position after that, and I built a life of sorts, small and quiet and respectable. I never married. I could not imagine letting another man touch me after Edward, could not imagine pretending to feel for someone else what I had felt for him. I heard, years later, that he had married Lady Arabella after all, that they had children, that he had become a model landowner and a pillar of the community. I was glad for him, in a distant sort of way, glad that he had found some measure of peace, or at least of purpose. But I also knew that there would always be a part of him that belonged to those stolen nights in the conservatory, to whispered conversations in dark hallways, to a housemaid who had loved him with everything she was. I am old now, and most of the people from that time are gone. Edward died 5 years ago. I read about it in the newspaper, a simple notice about the death of the Earl of Thornfield, for his father had passed before him and he had inherited the title after all. I wonder if he kept his own copy of that book, if he ever read through our notes and remembered. I wonder if he told his wife about me, or if I remained a secret he carried to his grave. I will never know, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that for a few brief months I was loved completely, seen fully, cherished despite every rule and convention that said I should not be. That kind of love leaves a mark, changes you in ways that never fade. It has been enough to sustain me through all the long years, through all the ordinary griefs and small joys of a life lived on the margins. I would not change a single moment of it, even knowing how it would end. Some things are worth the cost, worth the pain. Love, real love, is always worth it. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it moved you, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from.